In the space of 3 heartbeats, Betty Lopez would make a decision that defied every instinct society had programmed into her gentle soul. With 35-year-olds cowering behind tiny plastic chairs and masked gunmen barking orders in a language of violence she'd never learned to speak, this soft-spoken kindergarten teacher would do something that trained SWAT officers spend years learning to achieve. She would split 3 bullets mid-flight with nothing but a pair of classroom scissors, a protractor, and 15 years of being dismissed as, quote, just a kindergarten teacher. But first, she had to survive being the person everyone overlooked in a system that measured worth by volume rather than wisdom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Betty Lopez pulled into the faculty parking lot of Riverside Elementary at 6:47 a.m., just as she had every morning for the past 15 years. Her weathered Honda Civic looked embarrassingly modest next to the sleek SUVs and luxury sedans that belonged to the administrators and upper-grade teachers. She gathered her canvas bag filled with hand-cut paper stars, homemade learning aids, and a thermos of coffee that would have to last until lunch, then walked toward the building that had become both her sanctuary and her prison. The morning sun cast long shadows across the playground where Betty had spent countless hours watching children discover the world through games that adults had forgotten how to play. She moved with the unhurried pace of someone who understood that rushing through life meant missing the small miracles that happened between one breath and the next. Other teachers hurried past her, clutching their phones and complaining about district mandates, but Betty simply observed, filed away details, and prepared for another day of being invisible. Inside the main corridor, the familiar chaos of morning preparation buzzed around her like static electricity. Principal Margaret Harrison's voice echoed from the administrative office, sharp and efficient as she coordinated bus schedules and substitute teacher assignments. Betty nodded politely to the secretary, Mrs. Chen, who barely looked up from her computer screen. After 15 years, Betty had perfected the art of moving through spaces without disrupting the important people who had important things to discuss. "Morning, Betty," called out Jake Patterson, the 5th-grade teacher whose classroom was adjacent to the kindergarten wing. Jake was everything the school district loved in an educator. Young, energetic, tech-savvy, and blessed with the kind of commanding presence that could silence a rowdy classroom with a single look. Ready for another exciting day of finger painting and nap time? The comment carried the gentle condescension that Betty had learned to accept as part of her professional landscape. In the hierarchy of education, kindergarten teachers occupied a space somewhere between babysitters and actual educators. They weren't expected to understand complex pedagogical theories or contribute to curriculum development meetings. They were there to keep the smallest children safe, clean, and reasonably quiet until they were old enough for real learning to begin. "Something like that," Betty replied with a smile that revealed nothing of the intricate lesson plans she'd spent her weekend developing. Plans that incorporated advanced concepts of spatial reasoning, mathematical patterns, and critical thinking skills disguised as simple games and activities. Plans that none of her colleagues would ever see or appreciate because they were designed for 5-year-olds. And 5-year-olds didn't take standardized tests that reflected positively on teacher evaluations. Betty's classroom occupied the far corner of the building, separated from the main educational activities by 2 hallways and a heavy fire door that muffled the sounds of serious learning happening elsewhere. She unlocked her door and stepped into the space she'd carefully crafted over 15 years of working with children that other educators considered too young to matter academically. The room was a masterpiece of organized chaos that would have made efficiency experts weep. Every surface told a story of learning adventures. Walls covered with student artwork that demonstrated surprisingly sophisticated understanding of symmetry and pattern recognition. Reading corners equipped with books that challenged conventional assumptions about age-appropriate content. And activity stations designed to develop fine motor skills that most people didn't realize were the foundation for everything from handwriting to surgical precision. Betty began her morning routine with the methodical precision of a craftsperson preparing for complex work. She checked each learning station, ensuring that materials were positioned to encourage specific types of cognitive development. She reviewed her mental notes about each student's individual needs, learning styles, and emotional triggers. She prepared backup activities for children who might finish assignments early, and modified approaches for students who needed additional support. At 7:30 a.m., the first buses began arriving, and Betty could hear the distinctive sound of small feet running down hallways as children burst into the building with the uncontainable energy that adults spent their lives trying to recapture. She positioned herself at her classroom door, greeting each student by name with specific observations about their previous day's work or a detail about their family that she'd remembered from casual conversations. "Good morning, Marcus. Did your mom's car get fixed?" she asked a boy whose backpack was held together with duct tape and determination. "Morning, Sarah. I can't wait to see what you discovered about butterflies over the weekend," she said to a girl whose curiosity about the natural world bordered on scientific obsession. Each greeting was personalized, genuine, and based on Betty's uncanny ability to remember details that other adults overlooked or forgot. She knew which children came from homes where breakfast was a luxury, which ones were dealing with parents' divorce proceedings, and which ones had learning differences that hadn't been officially diagnosed because their families couldn't afford educational testing. By 8:15 a.m., 30 children had settled into their morning routine with the kind of seamless organization that looked effortless but required extraordinary skill to orchestrate. Betty moved through the classroom like a conductor leading a symphony, adjusting activities, redirecting energy, and maintaining the delicate balance between structure and freedom that allowed young minds to flourish. Mrs. Lopez called out Emma, a precocious 5-year-old whose questions often stumped graduate students. "Why do scissors work the way they do? Like, what makes them cut things?" Betty knelt down to Emma's eye level, a habit that had given her permanent calluses on her knees but allowed her to engage with children as intellectual equals rather than talking down to them from adult height. "That's a fascinating question, Emma. What do you think makes scissors different from, say, your fingers when you try to tear paper?" Emma's face scrunched in concentration as she considered the mechanics of cutting implements. "The scissors are like, they squeeze things apart?" "Exactly right. They concentrate force into a very small area, kind of like how a knife works, but with two blades working together. Would you like to experiment with different ways of separating materials?" Within minutes, Betty had transformed Emma's curiosity into an impromptu physics lesson that engaged 6 other children in exploring concepts of leverage, pressure points, and material properties. She used vocabulary that challenged their understanding while keeping explanations concrete enough for 5-year-old comprehension levels. From the hallway, Betty could hear Principal Harrison conducting a tour for visiting district officials, her voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of someone showcasing educational excellence. "Our upper-grade programs have achieved remarkable standardized test improvements," Harrison was saying, "and our STEM initiatives in grades 3 through 5 are attracting attention from state education leaders." The tour group paused outside Betty's classroom, and through the window she could see 3 men in expensive suits observing the controlled chaos of kindergarten learning. One of them gestured dismissively toward the classroom, while making a comment that Betty couldn't hear, but could easily interpret from his expression. Kindergarten was cute, but it wasn't serious education. It was glorified childcare with educational pretensions. Betty continued her work, helping children navigate the complex social negotiations required for sharing materials, teaching them to resolve conflicts through communication rather than tears, and embedding mathematical concepts into activities that felt like pure play. She was simultaneously a teacher, counselor, nurse, referee, and guardian angel to 30 small humans whose brains were developing at a rate that would never be matched again in their lifetimes. "Mrs. Lopez," whispered Tommy, a quiet boy who rarely spoke above a murmur, "I think I know why the pattern blocks fit together like that." Betty moved to his side, ready to listen to whatever insight had captured his attention. Tommy had arranged geometric shapes into increasingly complex patterns, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of spatial relationships that some high school students struggled to grasp. "Show me what you're thinking, Tommy." As he explained his discoveries about angles and symmetry using 5-year-old vocabulary, Betty felt the familiar satisfaction of witnessing a young mind making connections that would serve as building blocks for decades of future learning. This was the work that mattered, the foundation that made everything else possible, but it happened in spaces too small and quiet for important people to notice. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm of small victories and gentle redirections. Betty helped resolve a dispute over playground equipment that taught lessons about fairness and compromise. She guided a student through the frustration of learning to tie shoes, celebrating the eventual success with enthusiasm that made the achievement feel monumental. She noticed that one child seemed unusually tired and made a mental note to follow up with the family about sleep routines. By 10:30 a.m., Betty had already facilitated more meaningful learning experiences than most people encountered in an entire week, but none of it would appear in assessment reports or administrative evaluations. Her students were developing critical thinking skills, emotional intelligence, and collaborative abilities that would determine their success for the rest of their lives, but those achievements couldn't be measured by standardized tests designed for older children. As she prepared for the mid-morning transition to outdoor play, Betty reflected on the peculiar position she occupied in the educational ecosystem. She was simultaneously essential and invisible, trusted with the most important work in the building but excluded from the conversations where educational priorities were determined. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same administrators who dismissed kindergarten as just playing would panic if she called in sick, because finding qualified substitutes for her classroom was nearly impossible. Betty Lopez was about to discover that being underestimated by people who didn't understand the true nature of her work would become her greatest advantage when the unthinkable happened, and 30 children's lives depended on skills that could only be developed through years of patient, precise, and purposeful attention to details that everyone else considered too small to matter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The faculty meeting on Tuesday afternoon revealed everything Betty needed to know about how Riverside Elementary measured success, and it had nothing to do with the miracles happening in her classroom every day. She sat in the back row of the library, surrounded by teachers who commanded respect through volume and visibility, while Principal Harrison projected charts and graphs that reduced education to numbers that could be manipulated, celebrated, or used to justify budget decisions. "Our third-grade reading scores have improved by 12%, Harrison announced, clicking through slides that showed data trends and ascending lines of administrative triumph. Fourth-grade mathematics assessments exceed district averages by 15 points, and our fifth-grade science program has been selected as a model for 3 neighboring schools." Betty listened to the litany of achievements that painted Riverside Elementary as an educational success story, but noticed something that apparently escaped everyone else's attention. Not a single metric measured what actually mattered in child development. There were no assessments for curiosity, creativity, emotional resilience, or the kind of collaborative problem-solving skills that would determine these children's success in a world that hadn't been invented yet. "The State Education Department has identified standardized test performance as the primary indicator of school effectiveness," Harrison continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone repeating policy decisions she hadn't participated in making. "Moving forward, our instructional priorities will be aligned with assessment objectives that demonstrate measurable academic progress." Dr. Michael Stevens, the district's curriculum coordinator, stood to address the room with the confident bearing of someone whose expertise was validated by advanced degrees and administrative titles. He was the kind of educational leader who spoke fluent bureaucracy and could transform simple concepts into complex policy frameworks that sounded impressive in board meetings. "Research indicates that early intervention in core academic areas produces the most significant long-term outcomes," Stevens announced, consulting notes that looked like they'd been copied from educational journals. "We're implementing intensive literacy and numeracy programs beginning in kindergarten to ensure students are college and career ready from their earliest educational experiences." Betty felt a familiar tension building in her chest as she listened to theories about child development being presented by people who hadn't spent meaningful time with actual children in years. Stevens was describing 5-year-olds as if they were miniature high school students, who needed to be programmed for academic achievement rather than human beings whose brains were still forming neural pathways that would determine their capacity for learning, creativity, and emotional intelligence for the rest of their lives. "Mrs. Lopez," Stevens said, turning his attention toward the back of the room where Betty sat quietly taking notes, "as our kindergarten teacher, you'll be implementing structured literacy blocks that prioritize phonetic recognition and sight word acquisition. We're also introducing mathematical concept drills that will prepare students for first-grade arithmetic assessments." The room turned to look at Betty, and she could feel the collective expectation that she would nod enthusiastically and express gratitude for being included in this educational revolution. Instead, she cleared her throat gently and spoke in the measured tone she used when helping children navigate complex emotional situations. "Dr. Stevens, I wonder if we've considered how intensive academic drilling might affect children's natural curiosity and intrinsic motivation to learn. 5-year-olds are developmentally designed to explore their world through play-based discovery, and research in neurological development suggests that premature academic pressure can actually inhibit the formation of cognitive pathways that support lifelong learning. The silence that followed was the kind that occurs when someone says something technically accurate but socially inappropriate. Stephen's expression shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed irritation, and Betty could see several teachers exchange glances that communicated their discomfort with her implicit challenge to district policy. "Mrs. Lopez," Stevens replied with the patience typically reserved for explaining obvious concepts to slow learners, "while play-based learning has its place in early childhood education, we can't afford to waste critical learning time on activities that don't produce measurable academic outcomes. Parents expect their children to be reading by first grade, and we have a responsibility to ensure that happens through proven instructional methods." Betty nodded respectfully but felt compelled to continue the conversation that everyone else seemed eager to end. "I absolutely agree that children should be reading by first grade, Dr. Stevens. My concern is that drilling isolated skills without meaningful context might actually delay reading development rather than accelerate it. When children understand that written symbols represent ideas they care about, they become motivated to decode those symbols. But when we present reading as a series of disconnected tasks to be mastered, we risk creating the impression that reading is work rather than discovery." The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees as Betty's words hung in the air like an unspoken indictment of everything the district was trying to accomplish. She hadn't intended to sound confrontational, but her 15 years of watching children learn had taught her things that couldn't be captured in research studies or administrative policy documents. Principal Harrison intervened with the diplomatic skill of someone accustomed to managing uncomfortable moments. "Thank you for your input, Mrs. Lopez. I think we all appreciate different perspectives on educational approaches. Dr. Stevens, perhaps you could continue with the implementation timeline." The meeting proceeded without further interruption from Betty, but she could feel the subtle shift in how her colleagues regarded her. She'd crossed an invisible line by questioning educational policy in a public forum, transforming herself from a harmless kindergarten teacher into someone who might have opinions about matters beyond finger painting and nap time. After the meeting, as teachers clustered in small groups discussing the new requirements, Betty found herself increasingly isolated. Conversations quieted when she approached, and several colleagues who had previously been friendly now seemed uncomfortable in her presence. She'd violated an unspoken rule by suggesting that the experts might not understand everything about how children actually learn. "Betty," called out Sandra Williams, the second-grade teacher whose classroom philosophy aligned closely with district expectations, "you seemed pretty passionate about the new curriculum changes. Are you worried about implementing the literacy blocks?" The question carried layers of meaning that Betty recognized from years of navigating workplace politics. Sandra was offering her an opportunity to backtrack from her earlier comments, to clarify that she hadn't really intended to challenge Dr. Stevens' expertise or question the wisdom of district policy. It was a chance to return to her previous status as the harmless kindergarten teacher who stayed in her lane and didn't complicate important decisions with inconvenient observations. "I'm always concerned about doing what's best for the children," Betty replied carefully. "I want to make sure our methods support their development rather than working against their natural learning processes." Sandra's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course we all want what's best for the children. I just think sometimes we might overthink things instead of trusting the experts who've spent years researching effective educational practices." Betty recognized the subtext. Stay in your lane, trust your betters, and don't pretend to understand things that require advanced degrees in administrative experience. The message was delivered with professional courtesy, but its meaning was unmistakable. Over the following weeks, Betty watched the new policies transform Riverside Elementary into something that looked impressive on paper, but felt increasingly disconnected from actual learning. Kindergarten classrooms throughout the district implemented structured literacy blocks that replaced exploration time with phonics drills. Mathematics instruction focused on memorizing number facts rather than understanding numerical relationships. Art and music programs were reduced to make room for additional test preparation activities. Betty complied with the new requirements while trying to preserve opportunities for meaningful learning within the prescribed framework. She discovered ways to embed play-based discovery into structured lessons, found methods to maintain children's natural curiosity while meeting assessment objectives, and developed creative approaches that satisfied administrative expectations without completely abandoning developmentally appropriate practices. But she also began documenting something that concerned her deeply. The children in her classroom were becoming less engaged, less creative, and more anxious about their academic performance. 5-year-olds who had previously approached learning with joyful enthusiasm were now asking questions like, "Am I doing this right? And will this be on a test?" The natural confidence that allowed young children to take intellectual risks was being replaced by fear of making mistakes in front of adults who might judge their performance. Betty started keeping detailed notes about individual students' responses to the new instructional methods. She observed that children who had been thriving under play-based learning were now struggling with anxiety about academic expectations they couldn't fully understand. Students who had previously collaborated naturally were becoming competitive and secretive about their work. The classroom culture was shifting from cooperative exploration to individual performance anxiety. Most troubling of all, Betty noticed that the children's problem-solving abilities were actually declining under the new system. When faced with unfamiliar challenges, they increasingly looked to adults for correct answers, rather than experimenting with creative solutions. The very skills that would serve them throughout their lives — curiosity, persistence, collaborative thinking, and tolerance for ambiguity — were being systematically discouraged in favor of rapid recall of predetermined information. Betty realized she was witnessing an educational tragedy disguised as academic improvement. The system that claimed to be preparing children for future success was actually limiting their capacity for the kind of flexible, creative thinking that the future would demand. But she also understood that her observations contradicted official policy and professional consensus. Speaking up again would confirm her reputation as a troublemaker who didn't understand modern educational science. The stage was being set for a confrontation between Betty's understanding of how children actually learn and a system that measured success through methods that had nothing to do with genuine education. She was about to discover that being right about something important doesn't protect you from being wrong about everything else, and that sometimes the most dangerous position in any organization is being the person who sees problems that everyone else has agreed to ignore. The annual performance evaluation that would define Betty Lopez's career arrived on a gray October morning disguised as routine administrative procedure. Principal Harrison sat across from her in the sterile conference room adjacent to the main office, armed with assessment rubrics that reduced 15 years of educational expertise to checkboxes and numerical ratings. Betty had prepared for this meeting with the same meticulous attention she brought to lesson planning, but she was about to discover that preparation couldn't protect her from a system designed to measure everything except what actually mattered. "Betty," Principal Harrison began, consulting the tablet that contained Betty's professional fate in digital format, "I want to start by acknowledging your dedication to the students. Your classroom management is excellent, and parents consistently praise your communication and care for their children." Betty felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach as she recognized the diplomatic preamble that typically preceded disappointing news. 15 years of administrative conversations had taught her to listen for the word "however" that would negate everything positive that came before it. "However," Harrison continued right on schedule, "this year's evaluation reveals some significant concerns about your alignment with district educational priorities and your implementation of approved curriculum standards." The tablet screen reflected charts and graphs that transformed Betty's daily work with children into data points that painted her as educationally deficient. Her kindergarten students' performance on standardized readiness assessments ranked in the bottom third of the district. Their phonics recognition scores lagged behind grade-level expectations that had been established by committees of people who worked with spreadsheets rather than 5-year-olds. Most damaging of all, classroom observations indicated that Betty was spending excessive time on non-academic activities instead of focusing on measurable learning objectives. "I don't understand," Betty said, genuinely confused by the disconnect between her daily reality and the official assessment. "My students are developing critical thinking skills, creative problem-solving abilities, and collaborative learning strategies that will serve them throughout their educational careers. Just last week, Marcus solved a complex spatial reasoning puzzle that demonstrated mathematical thinking far beyond typical kindergarten expectations." Harrison nodded with the patient tolerance of someone explaining obvious concepts to a well-meaning but misguided employee. I'm sure Marcus's puzzle solving was very impressive, Betty, but it doesn't address the fact that he can't identify sight words at grade level or demonstrate phonetic decoding skills that our first-grade teachers expect. We're not evaluating children on their ability to play with puzzles. We're measuring their readiness for academic success. Betty felt the familiar frustration of trying to explain color to someone who insisted that only black and white existed. But Principal Harrison, Marcus's spatial reasoning directly supports his mathematical development, which connects to logical thinking patterns that enhance reading comprehension. These skills are interconnected, not separate subjects to be mastered in isolation. That may be true in theory, Harrison replied, but our assessment data indicates that your students are not meeting established benchmarks for kindergarten completion. Dr. Stevens has specifically noted that your classroom practices don't align with evidence-based instructional methods that produce measurable academic outcomes. The evaluation continued with systematic precision as Harrison reviewed each area where Betty's approach failed to meet district expectations. Her bulletin boards featured student artwork instead of academic word walls. Her lesson plans included too much time for exploratory play and insufficient focus on direct instruction. Her assessment methods emphasized individual progress rather than standardized comparison data that could be aggregated for district reporting. Most concerning, Harrison said, reaching the evaluation's climax, is feedback from your classroom observations. Dr. Stevens noted that you consistently prioritize student engagement over curriculum coverage, spend excessive time on individual learning differences instead of whole group instruction, and demonstrate resistance to implementing approved teaching methods. Betty's hands trembled slightly as she processed the accusation that her greatest strengths as an educator were being characterized as professional failures. Her ability to recognize and respond to individual learning needs, her skill at maintaining student engagement through meaningful activities, her commitment to developmentally appropriate practices, everything that made her an exceptional teacher was being used as evidence of her inadequacy. I'd like to request a meeting with Dr. Stevens to discuss these concerns, Betty said, maintaining her professional composure despite feeling like her career was dissolving around her. I believe there may be some misunderstanding about my teaching methods and their effectiveness. Harrison's expression suggested that requesting such a meeting was further evidence of Betty's failure to accept constructive feedback appropriately. Betty, I think it's important for you to understand that this evaluation reflects concerns that have been building for some time. Your resistance to new curriculum requirements, your questioning of district policy during faculty meetings, and your apparent belief that your individual teaching philosophy supersedes established educational standards have created a pattern that needs to be addressed. The words hit Betty like physical blows as she realized that her advocacy for children's developmental needs had been reinterpreted as insubordination, her professional expertise dismissed as stubborn refusal to evolve with modern educational practices. 15 years of dedication, countless hours of professional development, and genuine success with thousands of children meant nothing compared to assessment data that reduced education to numbers on a spreadsheet. What does this mean for my position? Betty asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. You're being placed on a professional improvement plan, Harrison announced, sliding a thick folder across the table. This document outlines specific areas where your performance must improve over the next 90 days. You'll receive additional supervision, mandatory training in approved instructional methods, and regular monitoring to ensure compliance with district standards. Betty opened the folder to find a document that read like an indictment of everything she believed about education. She was required to eliminate excessive time spent on creative activities, implement structured phonics instruction for minimum specified periods, focus on whole group direct instruction rather than individualized learning approaches, and demonstrate measurable progress on standardized assessment tools that had been designed for older children. The professional improvement plan represented more than criticism of her teaching methods. It was a demand that she abandon her understanding of child development and replace it with approaches that she knew would harm the children she'd devoted her career to serving. She was being asked to choose between keeping her job and maintaining her professional integrity. I need time to review this document thoroughly, Betty said, struggling to keep her voice steady as the implications of her situation became clear. Of course, Harrison replied with administrative courtesy that barely concealed her impatience. You have until Friday to sign the acknowledgement form and begin implementing the required changes. I should mention that failure to meet the improvement plan objectives will result in termination proceedings. Betty left the meeting carrying the folder that contained her professional death sentence, walking through hallways where she'd spent 15 years nurturing young minds and supporting families through their children's first educational experiences. Colleagues she passed offered polite smiles without making eye contact, as if professional failure might be contagious. In her classroom that afternoon, Betty watched her students engage in the kind of meaningful learning that would soon be replaced by drill and practice activities designed to improve test scores. Emma was teaching Marcus how to create symmetrical patterns with manipulative blocks, demonstrating peer collaboration and mathematical reasoning that exceeded grade-level expectations. Sarah had discovered that water moved differently through various materials, conducting independent scientific experimentation that revealed genuine curiosity about natural phenomena. These children were developing as confident, creative, collaborative learners who approached challenges with enthusiasm and persistence. But according to official assessment measures, they were failing to meet educational standards because they couldn't recite predetermined information on demand or perform isolated skills without understanding their purpose or meaning. Betty realized she faced an impossible choice: comply with requirements that she knew would harm children's development, or maintain her educational principles and lose her position. Either way, the children would suffer, either from inappropriate instructional methods or from losing a teacher who understood their developmental needs. That evening, Betty sat at her kitchen table reviewing the professional improvement plan with growing despair. The document demanded that she transform her classroom into a miniature academic factory where 5-year-olds would be processed through standardized procedures designed to produce measurable outputs. She was being asked to abandon everything she'd learned about how children actually develop and replace it with methods that looked impressive on paper but ignored human complexity. For the first time in her 15-year career, Betty Lopez seriously considered whether she belonged in education. The system she devoted her life to serving had determined that her greatest strengths were actually weaknesses, her deepest knowledge was actually ignorance, and her most important work was actually a waste of valuable instructional time. She had no way of knowing that this professional crisis would soon become irrelevant when faced with a situation where her unconventional skills would be the only thing standing between 30 children and unthinkable tragedy. The qualities that made her a failed teacher according to administrative standards would prove to be exactly what the world needed when everything most precious hung in the balance. Part 4. The Exile. Betty's exile from regular classroom teaching began on a Monday morning that felt like the end of everything she'd worked to build over 15 years. The reassignment memo arrived in her mailbox before dawn, typed on official letterhead that transformed her professional demotion into administrative efficiency. Effective immediately, she would be transferred to the Resource Learning Center, where she would provide for students with learning differences under the supervision of the district's special education coordinator. The Resource Learning Center occupied a converted storage room in the basement of Riverside Elementary, accessible through a maze of corridors that most staff members had never explored. The space felt like educational exile: fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical discontent, cinder block walls painted institutional beige, and windows positioned too high to provide natural light or hope of escape. It was where the school system stored its most challenging problems and the teachers who couldn't adapt to modern educational efficiency. "Welcome to the island of misfit toys," said Robert Chen, the veteran special education teacher who had been managing the resource center for 8 years. Robert was a quiet man, in his late 50s, whose patience had been refined through decades of working with children that other educators found too difficult, too slow, or too disruptive for regular classroom settings. "I heard about your reassignment. Administration's loss is definitely our gain." Betty looked around the cramped space that would become her new professional home, trying to process the dramatic change in her circumstances. Instead of her bright, cheerful kindergarten classroom filled with learning centers and student artwork, she now occupied a room designed for remediation rather than celebration, intervention rather than exploration. "What exactly will I be doing here?" Betty asked, genuinely uncertain about her role in this educational purgatory. Robert gestured toward a stack of individual education plans that represented children from across the elementary grades. "Officially, you'll be providing supplemental instruction for students who need additional support in core academic areas." Unofficially, you'll be working with kids who don't fit into the neat categories that make administrators comfortable. Betty spent her first week learning about students she'd never encountered during her years in kindergarten. There was David Martinez, a third grader whose brilliant mathematical intuition was overshadowed by severe difficulties with reading comprehension. Jessica Thompson, a fourth grader whose creative writing demonstrated sophisticated thinking but whose spelling errors made her work appear academically deficient. Ahmed Hassan, a second grader whose bilingual processing created temporary delays that teachers interpreted as learning disabilities rather than linguistic complexity. Each child carried an educational file thick with assessments, interventions, and professional opinions about their limitations. But as Betty worked with these students individually, she began recognizing something that their official documentation had missed entirely. These weren't children with learning deficits. They were children with learning differences that required approaches the regular education system couldn't accommodate. "David," Betty said during their second tutoring session, "show me how you figured out that multiplication problem." David's explanation revealed that he understood mathematical relationships with intuitive brilliance that exceeded grade-level expectations, but he processed information through visual spatial patterns, rather than the sequential verbal methods that classroom instruction assumed all children would naturally adopt. His learning disability was actually a learning strength that required different instructional approaches. "Jessica," Betty said while reviewing the girl's creative writing portfolio, "your stories show incredible imagination and sophisticated plot development. Tell me about your writing process." Jessica described how ideas flowed through her mind faster than her hands could capture them, leading to spelling errors and grammatical inconsistencies that masked the intellectual sophistication of her thinking. She wasn't struggling with writing. She was struggling with the mechanical aspects of transcription while her creative mind raced ahead with complex narratives. Betty began developing individualized approaches that worked with each child's cognitive strengths rather than trying to fix their supposed weaknesses. She discovered that David learned mathematical concepts through manipulatives and visual models that allowed him to see numerical relationships spatially. Jessica's writing improved dramatically when she could dictate her stories aloud before transcribing them, separating creative thinking from mechanical execution. "You're getting remarkable results with these kids," Robert observed after Betty's first month in the resource center. "David's math confidence has improved more in 4 weeks than in the previous 2 years combined. Jessica is actually enjoying writing assignments instead of dreading them." Betty had found something unexpected in her professional exile. Working with children who didn't fit standard educational molds had taught her things about learning and development that her 15 years in regular education had never revealed. These students required creative problem-solving, individualized approaches, and the kind of patient observation that she'd always brought to her teaching but had never fully appreciated. More importantly, Betty discovered that her new position provided access to information and perspectives that regular classroom teachers never encountered. She attended individualized education plan meetings where parents shared intimate details about their children's struggles and strengths. She collaborated with specialists, speech therapists, occupational therapists, behavior analysts, who understood learning through different professional lenses that enriched her understanding of child development. "Mrs. Lopez," said Carmen Rodriguez, the mother of one of Betty's students, "thank you for seeing Miguel as a whole person instead of just focusing on his reading delays. For the first time since kindergarten, he actually enjoys coming to school." Miguel was a quiet fifth grader whose processing speed differences had been misinterpreted as cognitive limitations throughout his elementary experience. Betty had discovered that he possessed deep analytical thinking abilities that emerged when given sufficient time to process complex information. His previous teachers had seen slowness. Betty recognized thoroughness and precision that would serve him well in future academic and professional endeavors. The Resource Center also provided Betty with access to school-wide data that regular classroom teachers never saw. She reviewed discipline reports that revealed patterns of behavioral issues connected to undiagnosed learning differences. She studied attendance records that showed how academic frustration led to school avoidance. She analyzed assessment data that demonstrated how standardized testing failed to capture the diverse ways that children demonstrated knowledge and skill development. "Robert," Betty said during one of their planning meetings, "have you noticed that many of the students we serve weren't identified as needing support until 3rd or 4th grade? Their difficulties seem to become apparent when academic demands increase, but I wonder if earlier intervention might have prevented some of these struggles." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right. By the time kids get referred to us, they've already experienced years of academic frustration and self-doubt. The system waits for them to fail before providing the individualized support they needed from the beginning." Betty began documenting patterns she observed across the diverse group of students she served. Many demonstrated advanced abilities in areas that weren't measured by standardized assessments. Others had learning styles that required multisensory approaches, collaborative opportunities, or self-paced exploration that regular classroom instruction couldn't accommodate. Almost all had been damaged psychologically by years of feeling academically inadequate, when their real need was for teaching methods that matched their learning preferences. "Mrs. Lopez," said Dr. Patricia Williams, the district's special education coordinator during one of her monthly visits, "your work with these students has been exceptional. Their progress reports show improvements that we rarely see in such a short time frame. What approaches are you using?" Betty hesitated, recognizing that her methods directly contradicted the standardized interventions that the district typically mandated for students with learning differences. "I spend time understanding how each child learns best, then adapt my instruction to match their cognitive strengths while gradually building skills in areas where they need additional support." Dr. Williams looked intrigued. "That sounds like individualized instruction based on learning profiles. Are you familiar with multiple intelligence theory or differentiated instruction research?" Betty realized that her intuitive understanding of child development had led her to discover educational approaches that academic researchers had been studying for decades. Her exile to the resource center had provided her with opportunities to develop expertise that regular classroom teachers never acquired, working with students whose complex needs demanded creative solutions and innovative thinking. As winter approached, Betty found herself in an unexpected position. Despite her official status as a failed teacher, serving her exile in educational purgatory, she was developing specialized knowledge and practical skills that few educators possessed. She understood learning differences, behavioral interventions, family dynamics, and individualized instruction at levels that her previous kindergarten experience had never demanded. The children she served were thriving under her individualized approaches. Their families were grateful for her holistic understanding of their complex needs, and even administrators were beginning to notice the dramatic improvements in students who had previously been written off as permanently struggling learners. Betty Lopez had discovered that being exiled from the mainstream educational system had actually positioned her to understand aspects of learning and development that mainstream educators never encountered. She was developing expertise that would soon prove invaluable when faced with a crisis that required understanding human behavior under extreme stress, individual differences in response to trauma, and the kind of innovative problem-solving that could only come from years of working with children who didn't fit conventional expectations. Her professional exile was about to become her greatest preparation for the challenge that would define not only her career, but her life. Betty's access to the forgotten corners of Riverside Elementary led her to discover something that would fundamentally change how she understood both education and human survival. It began with a routine maintenance request that took her into areas of the building where most staff members never ventured, but it would end with knowledge that no one was supposed to possess. The request had seemed innocuous enough: a report of water damage in the basement storage area adjacent to the Resource Learning Center that needed assessment before repair work could begin. As the only staff member with regular access to the lower level, Betty volunteered to investigate and document the damage for the facilities management team. What she found in the forgotten storage room would have been unremarkable to most people: boxes of outdated textbooks, broken playground equipment, and filing cabinets filled with administrative documents from previous decades. But Betty's 15 years of working with children had trained her to notice details that others overlooked, and something about the organization of these abandoned materials captured her attention. Mixed among the educational debris were boxes marked with codes that didn't match any filing system she recognized. The labels were handwritten in careful block letters: emergency protocols, classified, crisis response procedures, and most intriguingly, behavioral analysis, restricted access. Betty's curiosity, sharpened by months of discovering hidden complexities in her special needs students, compelled her to investigate further. The first box contained documents that revealed a side of Riverside Elementary that she'd never suspected existed. Detailed floor plans showed not just the building's educational spaces, but security camera locations, emergency exit routes, and safe rooms that had been designed for scenarios far more serious than fire drills or severe weather alerts. These weren't generic safety procedures. They were specific response protocols for crisis situations that the administration had never discussed with the teaching staff. Threat Assessment Matrix. Read one document that outlined procedures for evaluating various types of dangerous situations that could occur in school settings. Betty found herself reading descriptions of scenarios that ranged from armed intruders to hostage situations, each with corresponding response protocols that had been developed by security consultants and crisis management specialists. But it was the third box that contained information that made Betty's hands tremble as she read. Psychological profiles high-risk individuals contained detailed behavioral analyses of people who had been identified as potential threats to school safety. The documents were several years old, but they revealed that the district security department had been quietly monitoring and assessing individuals whose behavior patterns suggested possible violence toward educational facilities. Among the profiles was a thick folder labeled Foreign Nationalist Groups, Domestic Cells. Betty opened it with growing apprehension and found intelligence reports that documented the activities of several extremist organizations that had been tracked by federal law enforcement agencies. These weren't abstract threats. They were specific groups with documented capabilities and stated intentions to target American educational institutions as part of ideological warfare. One report, dated just 18 months earlier, described a cell of international extremists who had been conducting surveillance of elementary schools in their region. The document included photographs taken by undercover agents, communication intercepts that revealed planning discussions, and behavioral analyses that predicted how such groups might approach an attack on a school facility. Primary tactical approach would likely involve taking hostages, particularly young children, to maximize psychological impact and prevent aggressive law enforcement response, Betty read with growing horror. Subject groups demonstrate preference for prolonged standoff situations designed to attract media attention and communicate ideological messages to broad audiences. The report continued with details that felt like reading a script for her worst nightmares. These groups had specifically studied school layouts, security procedures, and response protocols. They understood how law enforcement agencies typically handled school crisis situations, and they had developed strategies designed to exploit weaknesses in standard emergency procedures. More disturbing still were the psychological profiles of typical group members. The documents described individuals who had been trained not just in weapons and tactics, but in psychological manipulation techniques designed to control frightened civilians, particularly children. They understood how to use fear, confusion, and the natural protective instincts of educators to maintain control over hostage situations. Betty discovered that these extremist cells had specifically researched how American teachers would likely respond to crisis situations involving their students. They knew that educators would prioritize children's safety over their own lives, and they had developed methods to exploit that dedication as a means of maintaining control and preventing outside intervention. Educational personnel present unique hostage control advantages, one analysis noted with clinical detachment. Strong emotional attachment to student welfare creates predictable behavioral responses that can be leveraged to ensure compliance with demands and prevent resistance activities. As Betty continued reading, she found detailed studies of how different types of educators might respond to extreme stress situations. The profiles were based on interviews with former hostages, analysis of previous school crisis incidents, and behavioral research that had been conducted by psychologists working with terrorist organizations. But it was the specific information about Riverside Elementary that made Betty realize this wasn't abstract intelligence gathering. This was operational planning for a potential attack on her school. The documents included aerial photographs of the building, detailed floor plans that showed more information than the emergency protocols she'd found earlier, and even staff schedules that had somehow been obtained through surveillance or infiltration. Target facility demonstrates optimal characteristics for extended standoff scenario. Read one assessment that analyzed Riverside Elementary with terrifying precision. Single-story construction limits escape options. Geographic isolation reduces rapid law enforcement response capability. And demographic profile of student population maximizes psychological impact for media coverage. Betty found photographs of the school's playground, cafeteria, and main hallways that had clearly been taken by someone conducting reconnaissance. The images were annotated with tactical notes about sight lines, potential defensive positions, and choke points that could be used to control movement throughout the building. Most chilling of all was a detailed analysis of the school's staff that included information about individual teachers, administrators, and support personnel. Betty found her own name listed in a document that assessed how different educators might respond to a crisis situation involving student hostages. Lopez, Betty, kindergarten teacher, the profile read. Psychological assessment indicates high emotional investment in student welfare, low likelihood of resistance activities that might endanger children. Compliant personality type suitable for hostage management. Recommend isolation from other staff to prevent collaborative resistance efforts. Betty realized that she'd been observed, studied, and categorized as part of operational planning for an attack that might already be in development. These weren't old documents gathering dust. They were active intelligence files that had been compiled by people who were seriously planning to harm her students and colleagues. She discovered that the extremist cell had identified specific vulnerabilities in the school's security procedures, understood the likely response patterns of local law enforcement, and developed detailed scenarios for maintaining control over hostages while negotiating with authorities. They had studied previous school attacks, learned from the tactical mistakes of other groups, and created sophisticated plans designed to maximize their chances of success. But as Betty continued reading through the psychological analyses and tactical assessments, she began to recognize something that the extremist planners had apparently overlooked. Their behavioral profiles were based on assumptions about how typical educators would respond to crisis situations. They had studied average teachers, standard procedures, and predictable human reactions to extreme stress. What they hadn't anticipated was someone like Betty Lopez, an educator who had been dismissed by the system as inadequate, who had developed unconventional skills through years of working with challenging students, and who possessed the kind of detailed knowledge about individual behavior patterns that came from 15 years of patient observation and creative problem-solving. The extremists expected teachers who would follow standard procedures, panic under pressure, and prioritize their own safety when faced with overwhelming threats. They had planned for educators who would think in conventional ways and respond with predictable desperation when their students were endangered. They hadn't planned for a kindergarten teacher who understood that sometimes the most effective solutions came from approaches that no one expected, who had learned to remain calm while managing multiple crises simultaneously, and who possessed specialized knowledge about human behavior under stress that had been developed through years of working with children who didn't fit standard categories. Betty carefully returned the documents to their boxes, but she photographed key pages with her cell phone, knowing that this information needed to be preserved and shared with appropriate authorities. As she made her way back to the Resource Learning Center, her mind was racing with the implications of what she'd discovered. Somewhere in the region, possibly very close to Riverside Elementary, were people who were actively planning to harm her students. They had studied the school, analyzed the staff, and developed sophisticated strategies designed to exploit every weakness in the building's security and every predictable response from the educators who worked there. But they had made one critical error in their planning. They had underestimated Betty Lopez, assuming she was just another predictable teacher who would respond to crisis with conventional fear and helpless compliance. They had no way of knowing that their, quote, compliant personality type suitable for hostage management was actually someone who had spent years developing exactly the kinds of unconventional skills that their operational planning had never considered. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test everything Betty had learned about managing impossible situations, understanding individual human behavior, and finding creative solutions when conventional approaches failed. The people who had dismissed her as an inadequate teacher were about to discover that being underestimated by everyone, including dangerous enemies, was about to become her greatest tactical advantage. Betty's attempt to warn authorities about the terrorist threat would have been straightforward if she'd been anyone other than a kindergarten teacher on professional probation serving exile in a basement resource room. Instead, her credibility had been systematically demolished by months of administrative dismissal, making her the least likely person anyone would believe when she claimed to have uncovered evidence of an imminent attack on Riverside Elementary. Her first call to the district security office resulted in a polite but dismissive conversation with Officer Thomas Bradley, a retired police detective whose primary responsibilities involved investigating vandalism and managing student discipline issues. Betty explained that she'd discovered classified documents indicating terrorist surveillance of their school, but her words seemed to evaporate into bureaucratic indifference. "Mrs. Lopez," Officer Bradley said with the patient tone typically reserved for addressing anxious parents and overwrought teachers. "I appreciate your concern about school safety, but those old security files you found are probably just outdated emergency planning documents. The district updates those protocols regularly, and what you discovered was likely material that should have been disposed of years ago." Betty tried to explain that the documents included recent photographs and current intelligence assessments. But Officer Bradley had already categorized her call as the kind of false alarm that nervous educators generated whenever they encountered anything that looked remotely suspicious. Her reputation as a failed teacher who had been demoted to remedial instruction preceded her, making her concerns seem like the desperate attention-seeking of someone whose professional judgment couldn't be trusted. "Sir, I have photographs of the documents," Betty insisted. "These aren't old emergency plans. They are operational intelligence files that show our school has been targeted for attack by organized extremist groups." "I'm sure you believe that, Mrs. Lopez, but district policy requires that we verify such claims through official channels. I'll need you to submit a formal security concern report through your building administrator, and if Principal Harrison determines that further investigation is warranted, she'll forward your concerns to appropriate law enforcement agencies." Betty realized that the very administrative hierarchy that had branded her as professionally inadequate was now preventing her from protecting the children she'd devoted her life to serving. Officer Bradley's dismissal wasn't malicious. It was the predictable response of a system that had already determined she lacked credibility about educational matters. Her meeting with Principal Harrison proved even more problematic. Harrison received Betty's concerns with the barely concealed impatience of someone dealing with a persistent disciplinary issue that refused to resolve itself appropriately. "Betty," Harrison said, consulting her calendar to determine how much time she could afford to spend on this conversation, "I understand that your current professional situation has been stressful, but I'm concerned that you might be overreacting to routine administrative documents. Your recent evaluation indicated some challenges with judgment and decision-making, and I wonder if this might be another example of misinterpreting normal procedures." Betty felt the familiar frustration of trying to communicate urgent information to someone who had already decided that her perspective was inherently unreliable. She pulled out her phone to show Harrison the photographs she'd taken of the terrorist intelligence files, but the principal barely glanced at the images before dismissing them as irrelevant. "These look like standard security planning documents that every school district maintains," Harrison said. "I'm sure they seem alarming to someone without experience in emergency management, but they're just contingency plans for various hypothetical scenarios. The fact that you found them in storage rather than active files suggests they're probably outdated materials that should have been disposed of properly." Betty tried to explain the specific details that identified current threats rather than hypothetical planning, but Harrison had already shifted into damage control mode. The last thing she needed was a failed teacher creating panic about imaginary terrorist threats just months before the district's annual safety evaluation. "Betty, I need you to understand that spreading unfounded security concerns could create serious problems for our school community. Parents are already anxious about their children's safety, and false alarms about terrorist threats could damage our reputation and undermine confidence in our safety procedures." "Principal Harrison, this isn't a false alarm," Betty said, struggling to maintain professional composure while her sense of urgency intensified. "These documents contain photographs of our building, detailed information about our staff, and operational plans for taking hostages. This is real intelligence about people who are planning to harm our students." Harrison's expression hardened with administrative authority that brooked no further discussion. "Betty, I'm going to be very clear about this. Your current performance improvement plan specifically addresses concerns about your judgment and decision-making abilities. Creating panic about imaginary security threats is exactly the kind of behavior that suggests you're not ready to return to regular classroom responsibilities." Betty realized that her attempt to protect the school was being interpreted as further evidence of her professional inadequacy. The same system that had dismissed her educational expertise was now dismissing her security concerns, creating a perfect storm of bureaucratic blindness that left everyone vulnerable to the threat she'd discovered. Her final attempt to reach outside authorities proved equally futile. The FBI field office that handled domestic terrorism cases operated through official channels that required law enforcement referrals or credible threat reports from verified sources. A kindergarten teacher calling about documents she'd found in a basement storage room didn't meet their criteria for immediate investigation. "Ma'am," explained Special Agent Jennifer Martinez during Betty's frustrating phone conversation, "we receive hundreds of calls from concerned citizens who believe they've uncovered terrorist activities. While we appreciate public vigilance, we need to prioritize threats that have been verified through established intelligence networks or law enforcement channels." Betty tried to describe the specific operational details that distinguished real intelligence from paranoid speculation, but Agent Martinez was following protocols designed to filter out false alarms from well-meaning but uninformed civilians. The fact that Betty had discovered these documents through unauthorized access to restricted files actually undermined her credibility rather than supporting it. If you believe there's a genuine security threat to your school, you need to work through your local law enforcement agencies and school district security personnel, Agent Martinez explained. They have the training and authority to evaluate potential threats and escalate concerns to federal agencies when appropriate. Betty hung up, feeling trapped in a bureaucratic maze that prevented her from protecting the people she cared about most. Every authority figure she'd contacted had dismissed her concerns because she lacked the credentials, position, or official standing to be taken seriously about matters of life and death importance. But Betty's years of working with challenging students had taught her that sometimes the most important problems couldn't be solved through official channels. When conventional approaches failed, creative solutions became necessary, even if they violated established procedures and institutional expectations. That evening, Betty made a decision that would transform her from a failed educator seeking administrative approval into a covert operative preparing to protect 30 children's lives through methods that no one would expect from a kindergarten teacher serving professional probation. She began studying the terrorist intelligence files with the same meticulous attention she brought to understanding her special needs students' behavioral patterns. She memorized the operational plans, analyzed the psychological profiles of potential attackers, and identified weaknesses in their strategies that they probably hadn't considered. Betty also began developing her own counterintelligence assessment of Riverside Elementary, viewing the familiar building through the lens of defensive tactics rather than educational programming. She identified potential weapons that could be improvised from classroom materials, mapped escape routes that weren't included in official emergency plans, and analyzed sightlines that could provide tactical advantages if she needed to protect students from armed attackers. Most importantly, Betty began preparing herself psychologically for scenarios that no education program had ever covered. She researched hostage survival strategies, studied crisis negotiation techniques, and learned about the psychological dynamics that occurred when trained killers encountered determined defenders in confined spaces. The same administrators who had declared Betty Lopez professionally inadequate were about to discover that being underestimated by everyone, including dangerous enemies, had given her the perfect preparation for the fight of her life. When official channels failed and institutional authority proved useless, the kindergarten teacher they'd dismissed as unreliable would become the only person standing between 30 innocent children and unthinkable horror. Betty's resistance to bureaucratic dismissal was about to become resistance in its most literal and life-saving form. The qualities that made her a failed teacher according to administrative standards, her unconventional thinking, her attention to overlooked details, and her willingness to challenge authority when children's welfare was at stake, were about to become exactly what the world needed when everything most precious hung in the balance. The attack on Riverside Elementary began at 10:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other day in Betty Lopez's carefully reconstructed professional life. She was working with Miguel Rodriguez in the Resource Learning Center, helping him develop reading comprehension strategies through visual mapping techniques, when the first gunshots shattered the illusion of safety that had protected the school for decades. Betty's specialized training with traumatized students had taught her to recognize the difference between ordinary disruptions and genuine crisis situations. The sound that echoed through the building's corridors wasn't construction noise, backfiring vehicles, or any of the mundane explanations that people typically use to rationalize unexpected sounds. It was the unmistakable crack of high-powered rifles being fired by people who understood exactly what they were doing. "Miguel," Betty said with the calm authority she'd developed through years of managing classroom emergencies, "I need you to move to the supply closet right now and stay very quiet. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe." The boy's eyes widened with fear, but he responded to Betty's steady voice with immediate compliance. 15 years of building trust with frightened children had prepared her for this moment when a child's survival would depend entirely on their willingness to follow her instructions without question or hesitation. Betty moved to her classroom door and peered through the reinforced glass window that provided a view of the main hallway. What she saw confirmed her worst fears about the intelligence documents she'd discovered weeks earlier. 3 masked figures in tactical gear were moving through the corridor with military precision, carrying assault weapons and communication equipment that suggested sophisticated planning and coordination. The attackers were executing the exact scenario that Betty had read about in the terrorist files, a methodical takeover of the building designed to secure maximum hostages while minimizing their own risk of capture or elimination. They understood the school's layout, knew where students and staff would likely be located, and moved with the confidence of people who had rehearsed this attack extensively. Betty watched them split up to cover different sections of the building, implementing a strategy that would allow them to control all major access points while herding victims into centralized locations for easier management. These weren't random shooters acting from desperation or rage. They were trained operatives executing a carefully planned military operation. The school's emergency announcement system crackled to life with Principal Harrison's voice, but it carried a tremor of barely controlled panic that revealed how unprepared the administration was for this scenario. This is a lockdown situation. All students and staff should remain in their current locations and await further instructions. Betty knew from the intelligence files that the attackers had studied standard lockdown procedures and developed tactics specifically designed to exploit those protocols. They expected teachers to barricade themselves in classrooms with their students, creating concentrated groups of hostages that could be easily controlled and used as leverage against law enforcement. But Betty also knew something that the attackers couldn't have anticipated. Her exile to the Resource Learning Center had provided her with detailed knowledge of the building's forgotten spaces, abandoned storage areas, and maintenance corridors that weren't included in the architectural plans that the terrorists had studied during their surveillance operations. The sound of children screaming from the main hallway told Betty that the attackers had begun gathering hostages from the regular classrooms. She could hear adult voices, teachers and staff members, trying to calm frightened students while probably experiencing terror that exceeded anything they'd ever imagined facing in their educational careers. Betty made a decision that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew her as the dismissed kindergarten teacher serving professional probation. Instead of waiting for rescue or hoping that law enforcement would arrive in time to prevent tragedy, she was going to actively resist trained killers who had superior weapons, tactical advantage, and detailed knowledge of everyone they expected to encounter. She moved to the emergency supply cabinet that she'd quietly modified over the past weeks, retrieving items that appeared to be standard educational materials but had been carefully selected for their potential defensive applications. Heavy-duty scissors that could function as weapons, industrial tape that could be used for restraints, and a collection of seemingly innocent classroom supplies that could be combined into improvised tools for protection and escape. Most importantly, Betty retrieved the detailed floor plan she'd drawn of Riverside Elementary's hidden spaces, storage rooms, utility corridors, and maintenance areas that connected different parts of the building through routes that the attackers wouldn't know existed. This wasn't the official emergency map that hung in every classroom. This was Betty's personal navigation system for spaces that most staff members had never explored. "Miguel," Betty whispered to the boy hiding in the supply closet, "I'm going to help some other children get to safety, but I need you to stay exactly where you are until I come back for you. Can you do that for me?" Miguel nodded with the trust that Betty had earned through months of patient, individualized instruction that had transformed his educational experience from frustration to confidence. "Yes, Mrs. Lopez. Be careful." Betty opened the Resource Learning Center's emergency exit, a door that connected directly to the building's lower-level utility corridors rather than the main hallways where the attackers were operating. Her years of working in the building's forgotten basement spaces had familiarized her with routes that most people didn't know existed. She moved through the maintenance corridors with the quiet precision of someone who had spent months exploring these spaces, following pathways that would allow her to reach different parts of the building without using the main hallways where armed killers were hunting for victims. Betty's destination was the kindergarten wing, where 35-year-old children were probably cowering in terror while their regular teacher tried to protect them, using emergency procedures that the attackers had specifically planned to overcome. As Betty navigated the hidden routes that connected Riverside Elementary's forgotten spaces, She could hear the attackers communicating through radio equipment, coordinating their movements and reporting on the hostages they'd secured. Their voices carried the professional calm of people executing a well-rehearsed operation, confirming that this was the sophisticated terrorist attack that the intelligence documents had predicted. But the attackers were about to encounter something that their extensive planning hadn't anticipated: a kindergarten teacher who had been systematically underestimated by everyone, including themselves, and who possessed exactly the combination of unconventional knowledge, desperate determination, and creative problem-solving skills that their operational assumptions had never considered. Betty reached the maintenance access point that connected to the kindergarten wing just as she heard the distinctive sound of classroom doors being forced open and children's voices rising in terror. The moment she'd been preparing for since discovering the intelligence files had finally arrived. Through the ventilation grating that provided access to the kindergarten classroom, Betty could see the nightmare scenario that the terrorist intelligence had described in clinical detail. 30 children huddled in the center of the room, while 2 masked gunmen secured the exits and established control over their hostages. The regular kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Patricia Collins, stood protectively near her students but was clearly overwhelmed by a situation that no educational training had ever prepared her to handle. "Everyone stay calm and follow instructions," one of the attackers announced in accented English, "and no one will be hurt unnecessarily. You are now part of an operation that will demonstrate the vulnerability of American educational institutions to determined resistance forces." Betty realized that the terrorists were using the kindergarten children as their primary hostage group because 5-year-olds represented maximum psychological leverage against both law enforcement and the broader community. These attackers understood that threatening small children would prevent aggressive rescue attempts and ensure maximum media attention for whatever ideological message they intended to broadcast. But they had made one critical error in their operational planning. They had assumed that the only resistance they might encounter would come from conventional security personnel following standard procedures. They hadn't planned for a kindergarten teacher who possessed detailed knowledge of their strategies, understood the building's hidden spaces, and had spent weeks preparing for exactly this scenario. Betty Lopez was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one that everyone has dismissed as harmless, and that the skills required to manage a classroom full of 5-year-olds included exactly the kind of patience, precision, and creative thinking that could turn the hunters into the hunted when everything depended on one perfect moment of absolute courage. What happened next in that kindergarten classroom would be analyzed by crisis negotiation experts, studied by counter-terrorism specialists, and remembered by 30 children for the rest of their lives, as the moment when their teacher became something that none of the adults in their world had ever expected her to be. Betty emerged from the ventilation system with the silent precision of someone who had spent months learning to move through spaces where detection meant death. The terrorists had positioned themselves according to standard hostage control protocols, one guarding the main entrance, another monitoring the windows, both maintaining visual contact with their captives while communicating with their coordinators through tactical radio equipment. But their training hadn't prepared them for resistance that would come from above, through building systems that their reconnaissance hadn't mapped, by someone whose psychological profile had categorized her as compliant and manageable. Betty dropped into the classroom with the calculated timing of a predator who had studied her prey's behavior patterns until she understood them better than they understood themselves. The first terrorist's weapon was disabled before he realized that the ceiling had become a tactical disadvantage. Betty's improvised restraining device, classroom scissors modified with industrial tape and geometric precision that would have impressed her kindergarten students, severed the rifle's firing mechanism with surgical accuracy that came from 15 years of making tiny adjustments to help children succeed. "What the gunman began, but his question was interrupted by Betty's second improvisation. The protractor and compass set that she'd requisitioned from the math supplies became a precision instrument for pressure point manipulation that rendered him unconscious before he could complete his sentence. The second terrorist turned toward the disturbance, but Betty had already calculated his reaction time based on the behavioral analyses she'd memorized from the intelligence files. She moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had managed classroom crises involving 35-year-olds simultaneously, except now the stakes involved life and death rather than educational outcomes. Her third weapon was the most unconventional of all, the deep understanding of human psychology that came from years of working with children whose behavioral patterns couldn't be managed through standard approaches. Betty spoke to the remaining gunmen in the calm, authoritative voice that had convinced countless frightened students to trust her judgment even when they didn't understand her methods. "Your partner is unconscious but unharmed," she said, maintaining the steady tone that had never failed to capture a child's attention. "Your radio communication has been disrupted, your extraction plan is compromised, and law enforcement is surrounding the building. You have 30 seconds to surrender your weapon before this situation becomes significantly more complicated for you." The terrorist's confusion was visible even through his tactical mask. Nothing in his operational training had prepared him for a middle-aged kindergarten teacher who spoke with command authority while somehow knowing details about their mission that should have been classified. His psychological preparation had focused on managing terrified civilians, not negotiating with someone who appeared to understand his tactics better than he did. "You're just a teacher," he said, his voice carrying uncertainty that hadn't been there during the initial assault. "You're absolutely right," Betty replied, never breaking eye contact. "I'm just a kindergarten teacher who has spent 15 years learning how to manage situations where frightened people make dangerous decisions. Right now, you're frightened, and you're about to make a decision that will determine whether you survive the next 60 seconds." While speaking, Betty had been moving with the subtle precision of someone positioning herself for actions that the terrorist couldn't anticipate. Her years of classroom management had taught her how to manipulate spatial relationships, control attention focus, and create opportunities for intervention that looked like accidents but were actually carefully orchestrated outcomes. Akda. The terrorist made his decision by raising his weapon toward the children, but Betty had predicted this response based on the psychological profiles she'd studied. Her countermove came with the split-second timing that separated successful teachers from those who couldn't manage classroom chaos. She intercepted his aim while simultaneously deploying her final improvised weapon. The 3 bullets that he fired were met by Betty's most impossible improvisation: classroom scissors positioned with mathematical precision to split each projectile in mid-flight, redirecting the fragments harmlessly into the ceiling tiles while she completed her disarmament of the second attacker, with techniques that combined child psychology, leverage physics, and the desperate determination of someone protecting the most important people in her world. The entire engagement lasted 47 seconds from Betty's emergence from the ceiling to the moment when both terrorists were restrained and their weapons secured. But those 47 seconds transformed Betty Lopez from a failed educator into a legend that would be discussed in crisis management courses and counter-terrorism training programs for decades to come. "Mrs. Lopez?" whispered Emma, the precocious 5-year-old whose questions about scissors had unknowingly contributed to saving all their lives. "Are the bad men going to go away now?" "Yes, sweetheart," Betty replied, returning to the gentle voice that had comforted thousands of children over 15 years of teaching. "The bad men are going away, and you're all safe now." The aftermath transformed not just Betty's life, but the entire educational system that had dismissed her as inadequate. Federal investigators who reviewed the incident discovered that her analysis of the terrorist intelligence had been more accurate than assessments produced by agencies with billion-dollar budgets and advanced surveillance technology. Mrs. Lopez's intervention prevented what could have been the deadliest school attack in American history, announced FBI Director Sarah Johnson during the press conference that made Betty an overnight national hero. Her understanding of the threat, her preparation for defensive action, and her execution under extreme pressure represent the highest levels of civilian courage and tactical thinking. Principal Harrison, Dr. Stevens, and the entire administrative hierarchy that had branded Betty as professionally inadequate found themselves trying to explain how they had failed to recognize exceptional capabilities in someone who had worked under their supervision for 15 years. Betty's professional improvement plan became exhibit evidence in congressional hearings about educational assessment methods and institutional blindness. "We clearly failed to recognize Mrs. Lopez's extraordinary abilities," Principal Harrison admitted during testimony that would end her administrative career. "Our evaluation methods were focused on conventional metrics that couldn't measure the kind of creative intelligence and crisis management skills that ultimately saved 30 children's lives." Betty was offered positions with federal law enforcement agencies, private security firms, and educational consulting companies that wanted to understand how a kindergarten teacher had accomplished something that trained counterterrorism specialists study for years to achieve. But her response surprised everyone who thought they finally understood what Betty Lopez was capable of. "I appreciate all the generous offers," Betty said during her first public interview since the incident. "But my career was never about proving that I was special. It was about helping children learn and grow in environments where they feel safe and valued. That's still the most important work I can imagine doing." Betty returned to teaching, but now in a role that no one questioned or dismissed. She became the director of a new educational program that combined child development expertise with crisis preparedness training, teaching other educators how to recognize and develop the kind of unconventional skills that could protect students while supporting their learning. Her classroom became a laboratory for innovative approaches that valued individual differences, creative problem-solving, and the kind of attention to detail that revealed important truths in overlooked places. Students who had been labeled as failures by conventional assessment methods thrived under Betty's instruction, discovering that their differences weren't deficits, but potential strengths that needed appropriate development. Mrs. Lopez taught us that sometimes the person everyone thinks is wrong might be the only one who sees what's really important, wrote Marcus, her former special needs student, in a college application essay 5 years later. "She showed me that being different isn't something to fix. It's something to understand and use to help other people." The kindergarten classroom where Betty had made her impossible stand became a memorial to the power of underestimated people doing extraordinary things when everything depends on their willingness to act with courage and creativity. A plaque near the door reads, "Sometimes the most important solutions come from the people who see problems that everyone else has learned to ignore." Betty Lopez had proven that being dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated by systems that measure worth through conventional metrics can actually be the perfect preparation for moments when conventional thinking fails, and only creative courage can save what matters most. The children she had protected grew up knowing that heroes don't always look like what people expect, that strength comes in forms that can't be measured by standard assessments, and that sometimes the most powerful person in any situation is the one who everyone assumed was powerless. Betty's story became a reminder that in a world that often confuses loudness with leadership and credentials with capability, the quiet voices of people who actually understand what they're talking about might be the most important ones to hear, especially when everything precious hangs in the balance, and only genuine wisdom can light the way through impossible darkness towards safety, hope, and the kind of future worth protecting. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.